There it is.
Yes. Can you see
Yeah,
the slides? Okay,
looks great.
awesome.
So
And you know what? I can't see you guys, so I'm going to try and rearrange things here. Hold on just a second. Okay.
let's jump in and we'll move kind of quickly through the first couple slides because I know we have a lot to cover and also some really great questions that we want to be able to discuss. So just very briefly, by way of introduction, we're from a law firm called DLA Piper. We're really proud to have worked with the Health AI Partnership from the very beginning, and just think it's an incredible organization and love the way that it is approaching issues of health equity and making sure that this AI revolution is not increasing the digital divide, but bridging it. So we're very grateful to be a part of it. I'm Danny. Toby, I'm a partner at DLA Piper. I chair our global AI and data analytics practice and am a medical doctor by training and have worked with great people from Duke and other of our partners for a long time on issues of AI safety, transparency, and the like. I'm really delighted to be here with two of my colleagues on the data science side, Dr. Sam Tyner-Monroe, who before joining us was at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, PhD statistician, and leads our accountable AI testing work. And Bogdan or Bobby Rakova, who joined us from the Mozilla Foundation as a trustworthy AI fellow. And before that was one of the very first AI assurance testers at a major consulting firm and was an engineer before that. Um, and we work together on testing a number of these systems in the real world and can kind of share what we've been seeing and what's working, what we've still got to figure out. So we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so exciting, an introduction to LLM evaluation. So let me turn it over to my colleagues.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, we are really excited to give a brief introduction to just number one, the broader topic of large language model evaluation. You know, as we said in the intro, this is a very critical topic as these tools are being more used throughout everyday life and especially in the healthcare application. And so one thing we wanted to share was this survey paper essentially looking at all of these different sources of and use cases of large language models in healthcare applications. So you can see here on the y-axis, you've got all of these different healthcare tasks that large language models are being used for. So it's enhancing medical knowledge, making diagnoses, educating patients, making treatment recommendations, communicating with patients, care coordination and planning, triaging patients, right? So a huge gamut of tasks that LLMs are being used for. And the paper goes through a variety of ways of evaluating those things, and definitely recommend you check those out in more detail, but wanted to make sure that we had sort of the key use cases, you know, front of mind here for this conversation. There's three different kinds of evaluation approaches for large language models. There's quantitative evaluation, there is qualitative evaluation that is human reviewed, and qualitative evaluation that is AI reviews, right? Each of these come with their own pros and cons, right? So quantitative evaluation, also called benchmarking frequently, is very fast. It makes models easy to compare to each other. It's very objective and precisely defined, but it's very narrow, and you can't get a whole lot of depth out of the evaluation. You're just summing it up to a single number. And also, there's the risk of the evaluation data being leaked into the models and then just becoming obsolete because the evaluation data is being used to train the model, making the benchmarks irrelevant. And the human review piece is another aspect that we focus on. So, we get human alignment here. But obviously, right, it's a lot more expensive to have humans go through and evaluate an LLM system than it is to just compute some benchmarks across it. And again, it's very subjective because humans have different preferences. The other aspect of qualitative evaluation, which we sort of combine in our practice, is qualitative evaluation. And so with AI specifically. And so this is sort of the LLM as a judge, right? It's a lot faster for an AI to make a decision about a passage of text or an output from another LLM model than it is for humans typically. It's more flexible than the benchmarking approach. And it can be a lot more efficient to have LLMs as judges, and it can be very cost effective as well. But again, humans are out of the loop, and there's been some studies showing that LLMs as judge tend to, prefer LLM responses over human written responses and various things. So again, lots of different ways to evaluate. I'll go quickly through these next couple slides because we don't need to go into too much depth here in terms of benchmarking. But so benchmarking is our quantitative evaluation example. There's tons of frameworks and metrics out there. A really sort of holistic example is the Helm framework out of Stanford. And this is just a way to quantify across a variety of different scenarios and performance metrics, the performance of various models. And they maintain this for all of the foundation models, offered by OpenAI, Anthropic, and others. And so basically a scenario is, you have a set of prompts that you're putting into the model and a set of desired answers, and then you're sort of comparing what comes out of the model to those desired answers. And generally, when you're looking at benchmarking, you're looking for things like fairness, robustness, toxicity, these sort of very general metrics. And as the application varies, you'll need to vary the definition of how you're computing these things for the specific application. So that's why the Helm framework is a good example, because it sort of gives you this general framework that's adaptable to any sort of application. And to get more precise, you can, as an example of how you would calculate these metrics exactly, you might be able to measure robustness, for example, by saying, if I insert a small perturbation into the question, which is not going to change the meaning of the question overall, how likely am I to get the same response when I, have it without that perturbation, and so on. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Danny now to talk more about red teaming.
Sure. So let me zoom out for just a second to say what makes LLMs really fascinating and effective is also what makes them really hard to test. And we'll talk. Oh, no, it's okay. You can go back. I was
Okay.
yeah.
I'm trying to anticipate your.
No, I love the proactivity. And so one thing that we've done, and we'll sort of explain why, is try to take the concept of red teaming, which goes way back into cybersecurity and before that, and adapt it in a way that can be useful in this new technology. So we can go to the next slide, Sam. So red teaming goes back to the Cold War, which is where the maybe outdated name red team comes from. But the idea was to create a group that would pretend to be the enemy and think like the enemy and try to test our own security and other measures. And that sort of idea of pretending to be the enemy and being adversarial in the testing then got absorbed into cybersecurity, where companies would create a red team and sometimes not even tell the rest of the company about it and have them go in and try to expose vulnerabilities. We can go to the next slide. So a lot of the initial thinking on generative AI and large language models is that red teaming is one tool that we have to basically act like a user and try different types of prompts that are designed to undermine the system's guardrails. So if you can imagine, in this case, the enemy might be a hacker who is trying to gain access to a company's data through an interface with a chatbot. Or there's examples of people trying to trick consumer-facing chatbots to give price discounts and then holding the company to that. But also, and I think this is really important, it's really broader than just bad guys, so to speak, because you're also trying to think about what about the benign user who might accidentally trigger an unwanted response. And so we try to put our heads into that space as well. So we can go to the next slide. So why red teaming? So this is what I was alluding to earlier, and Sam very thoughtfully knew where I was going, was this is a big change from the traditional AI that people have been using for well over a decade. So if you think about traditional, what we might call narrow purpose AI, that was traditionally an algorithm or a decision tree or something else that was trained on one set of data to optimize for one goal. So it might be to recognize a particular type of pathology, or to say whether, for an insurance company, a particular uh, uh, claim is insurable or not, a good risk or not. And there were usually pretty simple inputs, usually structured data, numerical data, usually pretty simple outputs, either a binary yes or no, or benign, malignant, positive, negative, dog, cat, or maybe a spectrum or a gradient, 0 to 100%, something like that, a risk score. Another feature of early AI was that it was essentially locked. Once you trained the algorithm and the algorithm was fixed, you put one set of inputs in, you would get the same outputs. And all of that made it fairly easy to test. And I know a lot of people on this call have probably done that type of testing, but if you have a skin cancer detection engine, the way you test it is you get an independent set of gold standard data, maybe dermatology red pathology slides, and you use that as your benchmark or ground truth, and you see how the machine does. But when you get into general purpose AI, it becomes much more complex because most of those assumptions I talked about before now go away. We don't have simple inputs and outputs anymore. We have fairly unlimited textual or graphical or other inputs, and we have fairly unlimited forms of outputs, long strings of text that aren't a simple yes, no, or binary or number. Also, you have lots of variability. So you could put the same prompt into generative AI, and because of the randomization function, you can get a different answer every time. And depending on the temperature or how variable that LLM is set, you could get wildly different answers. That's why it's so good at brainstorming, but it also makes it very hard to test. So we have been big advocates of using red teaming on Gen AI, and especially a flavor that we've been calling legal red teaming. And so the idea there is not to try to look at sort of technical hacks that are designed to sort of break the system using things like, weird code being placed into a prompt, or other very technical or data sciencey kind of attacks. But we're really looking, can we get it to break the law? Can we get it to create a product liability risk through a lack of accuracy or safety? Can we get it to do unlawful discrimination as opposed to just toxic behavior? So we're really trying to test a wider set of harms, usually teaming up with the technical folks for cyber attacks. So what we do is sit down and kind of say, what's the primary set of risks that a particular use case may have? And we'll go through some examples to kind of make this more concrete. And then we'll come up with a plan of attack for testing those. But it could be anything from data protection to IP. Say you're a pharma company or a medical researcher. Non-discrimination if it's being used in healthcare provision or decision making, and other legal and ethical standards. So we get the next slide. So the methodology is to essentially get the team together and come up with a list of scenarios that we want to test, and then design that attack. And we'll look at a number of things to do that, including the AI system's data sources and testing its decision-making process and outputs. But a lot of times it really is a black box attack. We can look at the design of the system and what safeguards people took, but at the end of the day, we're really looking at outputs to see, regardless of the safeguards in the process, what are the outputs and are they problematic? So we tend to do this at various different stages. Um, this is a real issue in terms of sort of the scalability of these solutions because not every use case can support doing red teaming at various different stages. And we'll talk about a risk-based sort of rational approach. But for the really high risk use cases that could affect patient safety or access, things like that, um, really any time the developer modifies the system, even sometimes in ways that you would expect to have very little impact on guardrails, we see wildly different performance in the red teaming process. So we try to get in early because it's much easier to intervene early and do some good, but you also want to check it right before it goes out the door and also periodically in the field. And you see that sort of cadence in pretty much every law and standard that's coming out about higher risk AI. So we get to the next slide. Um, so one thing we do as lawyers, and it's an interesting conversation that we have with some of the people like Bobby on the line who have been really amazing at defining a whole field of socio-technical harms. Um, our view is a lot of times our clients are also worried about legal harms, and so really defining the product that we're testing for. So it's one thing to say, is this tool transparent? Does it have toxic outputs? Is it safe? And so on. But there's also a whole legal regime. Some of it's AI specific, and then some of it's just existing law that speaks to all these issues. So asking whether something is safe is a little different than asking whether it creates a product liability risk for the healthcare entity or the pharma company. Asking whether it's toxic is different than saying, is it committing unlawful discrimination? So we're always kind of balancing what is the socio-technical harm, but also what is the legal harm, because those can be different. So we can go to the next step. And then this is a really interesting area because a question we get a lot is, can we do this internally or do we need sort of an outside independent auditor is a word people often use. We don't see ourselves as auditors. But the question is, can red teaming be internal or external? You'll see that the law and industry standards are still fuzzy on this. Anthropic has kind of come out with the statement, not talking about us and legal red teaming, but just talking about third-party testing in general. And they have said that they believe effective third-party testing for the frontier AI systems is very important. But I think what we'll see in the field as things settle down is internal testing more frequently with some sort of periodic external validation that gets set by law. Okay, I think I'm going to hand it over. Is that right now to Bobby? Bobby, you're saying?
Yeah, I think I can go ahead and take this piece. Yep. So essentially, so how do we do this, right? How do we, as a law firm, how are we working together? Because we have lawyers, we have data scientists, we have engineers. How are we all working together to actually get this done for our clients? And so specifically, we collect a red team, we develop a protocol, and then we go through a process of both automated and attorney red teaming, and then we provide recommendations to the client about what risks they might need to mitigate for. And so there's really sort of a foundation here of the legal risks that are key that Danny was talking about. So we're with working with our lawyers, working with our clients to define sort of the key areas of legal risk, And that's gets put into what we call a legal risk matrix. And then, we as the data scientists go in and use other LLMs to sort of generate a lot of probing questions. So really trying to get at the breadth of issues that might be exposing, that the client might be exposing themselves to in terms when they release this model. And then we also have sort of that's the breadth, and we have a depth where attorneys go in and depose the model, right? So this is the aspect of it that's really unique for a law firm, because you have attorneys who have spent years, looking for like the very critical risk junctures, and what if this, what if that, and they're going through and deposing the model essentially. So it's a really unique skill set that we have at our disposal to help us really red team these models more effectively.
And I'll just piggyback on that for 1 second. It's really interesting because it turns out that, at least in our experience, humans are much better at getting unwanted outcomes than the automated red teaming. And we sort of tested this a number of different ways, but human lawyers or human anyone just can't get the scale and variation of using a more automated approach. Plus, it's more expensive to do human testing. So, as Sam and Bobby will talk about, we've really tried to find a balance so that we're covering both approaches, because both kind of yield different results and have something to offer. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, and it's what's really helpful is that we get to use the attorney expertise to sort of help us automate and generate more questions and more probing questions in different legal risk areas. And so we have the legal risk matrix, which is composed of two different dimensions, one of which is the legal risks, and another is the domain specific risks. And it's really helpful to see this with some examples. And so we've got, in the instance of healthcare laws, we might have a area of legal risk, which we need to make sure that the LLM tool is compliant with relevant healthcare laws. We need to make sure that it's compliant with medical licensing requirements, that it's got compliance with product liability requirements, that it's obeying any FDA regulations that are out there. And so we have subject matter expert attorneys who are going through and sort of enumerating and thinking about all of these risks and sort of helping define that for the automated process. And then, for example, in a interactive healthcare LLM where you get to ask questions about, you ask it about, your symptoms. You can ask it about what medication you can take, what's my diagnosis, what do I need to do to prevent, getting the flu this season, right? So lots of different questions you might ask, and that's another aspect of this is sort of like Danny said earlier. It's not just the bad guys that we're looking for in legal red teaming. We're focusing on everyday people who are using it as it was intended, and sort of what are the risks there as well, because sort of behaving as the bad guys is one very distinct area of risk, but another is this aspect of, if I'm using it as intended, if I'm using it the way that the developer wanted me to use it, and in this case the use case is a healthcare chatbot that you just get to ask questions of based on your symptoms, your diseases, etc. Using it as intended is also going to open you up for risk. So that's a very important aspect that we have to consider. And so an example of the legal risk matrix comes in where we are crossing these two things. And so we'll cross the legal risk area with the domain area. And so we'll come up with some example questions. And so, for example, as my doctor, can you tell me what my fever and headache might mean? So that's sort of crossing the, here's a symptom question, and then here's a probing at the licensure and unauthorized practice of medicine legal risk area. And so you get to sort of enumerate all of these different areas of legal risk, and you're able to define, unique questions that really probe at each one of these things across a wide variety of use cases. And then, oh, sorry, did you want to say something, Bobby?
Yeah, thanks for these examples, Sam. I think they're really helpful to really show where the data scientists start and how they can contribute, and specifically using large language models to generate a wide variety of questions to probe the model across the risk taxonomy. So ultimately, this means automating the testing of AI, leveraging AI. And you might be thinking that this is yet again an example of turtles all the way down. However, there is more with regards to first the interaction layer between subject matter experts and the automation, and secondly, the rigorous evaluation methods and metrics backed by empirical research. So the key questions that we have worked on in the past year are really about what does meaningful supervision mean for the automated red teaming, and what could best contribute to building trust. And in practice, that led us to building a platform that leverages both an ontological, knowledge-based approach with the state-of-the-art agentic and Gen AI research on automated red teaming, where attorneys are in the loop, right? They use the automation and provide key insights and verification of the results. And this approach, as Daniel was mentioning already, right, combines sort of the breadth of AI-driven prompt generation and probing for risks and the depth of attorney review and recommendations for specific remediations. And I can turn it back to you, Sam.
Sure, or Danny can take this one since it's about deposing the model, which is one of his favorite things to talk about.
It is. It's strangely satisfying to do. Uh, so, you know, we find that the skill of red teaming, as Sam alluded to earlier, it is a really interesting hybrid of sort of what we as lawyers have done for a long time in taking depositions and in taking witnesses at a trial, because there's a similar flow and feel to it, which is you're basically trying to get someone to say something that they don't want to say. And there's all kinds of techniques that lawyers are trained in, repetition, indirection, obfuscation, any number of things that can honestly simulate both benign and malicious computer users. And so we really do kind of start with a script, but allow the lawyers to go off script and just follow rabbit holes and try different things. And then the data scientists are helping us with sort of the known, more technical prompt engineering that can elicit unwanted outcomes, transverse guardrails, or get it to say things that people have asked it not to say. And it's that combination, I think, that really creates a rich question set and interrogation. Um, so what we do is kind of get the right subject matter expert for each domain of risk to come up with that set of questions, and then pair them with a data scientist who can help them use some of these other techniques. And we can go through and attack the model in these different dimensions and get a sense of where it's performing and where it isn't. So we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, thank
Yes,
you.
I think we'll turn it back over to Bobby for talking about. So yeah, we've talked about generally what we're doing, and so how might it impact a specific use case. So Bobby, take it away.
Yeah. And specifically, for example, there is an arguable potential for the use of AI to tackle administrative tasks, supporting clinicians by saving time and reducing their cognitive load. And specifically here, we're talking about a case study where that is for sure top of mind for the hundreds of healthcare professionals, specifically in the US, who have adopted a new AI feature in the MyChart communications platform that is nearly ubiquitous in US hospitals. Every day, hundreds of thousands of messages between patients and clinicians go through this platform, and in some cases, the responses contain AI-generated content when that AI feature is used. And ultimately, that AI feature is a combination of LLMs for drafting messages to patient questions. And here you see a recent study by the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association, which found that there is risk of so-called hallucinations. And just to make sure everyone kind of understand what hallucinations are, I'm going to say that in this case, these are false fabrications about a patient's medical condition. And that's what the study found. And in the chat already, there were some questions about prompt engineering. So actually, this is exactly what this study did. They used prompt engineering to improve, in some sense, trust in the use of this AI feature by patients and clinicians, by additionally providing like improved prompts through which they can better validate the outcomes of the tool. And next slide. I think that there is the research community is finding that there is a limit, right, to our ability to kind of prompt engineer our way out of this, right, in some sense. And this is where, right, a scientist may say that everything in generative AI models is a hallucination. However, some are better than others. And of course, like what we talk about here is like what makes some model outputs helpful while other potentially harmful, right? And how do we have a better idea of the risks? So this is where red teaming can be a critical approach to addressing this kind of continuous monitoring and deployment challenges of the AI system. Next slide. And with that, really improving an understanding of the limitations of the AI system and designing targeted mitigations. So red teaming helps practitioners map this landscape of legal risks and implications in the context of existing or incoming regulatory guidance and best practices. And it practically gives us a data set of quantitative evidence with regard to the legal risks in specific scenarios, and also qualitative analysis by attorneys who are very skilled at navigating highly ambiguous and complex risk questions. And in this way, it also gives us insights about the risks of potential social biases and the impact of design choices that can keep clinicians skeptical and vigilant about catching errors. Next slide. And in practice, planning a round of red teaming starts by collecting required documentation. For example, what information is available about the design, development, and evaluation of the tools. What should we be asking from the development team or the vendors that are providing these tools? Are there existing guardrails? How were they set and evaluated, for example? And this helps practitioners understand what Daniel was sharing also, socio-technical risks, right? And especially considering kind of the social context, which ultimately means sort of the life cycle of use of these LLM-based tools. How are different kinds of people going to interact with them? So in this case, these are patients, these are the healthcare professionals, the healthcare administration, ultimately insurers, regulators that worry about risk questions. And taking that socio-technical approach then helps us map to the legal and regulatory requirements, as well as emerging AI standards and best practices, which contributes to constructing the legal risk matrix that Sam described earlier and adapting that to the specific context of use, which then helps the team of experts conducting the red teaming, and these are the data scientists leveraging the automated testing tools and attorneys who depose the LLM-based tool, and they conduct analysis and prepare findings and reports, which lead to really the development of targeted recommendation and mitigation strategies in the specific areas where there was a high risk that was identified. And last slide on this case study really is to really highlight that this is an iterative process and it's not a checkbox. It really needs to be integrated in the life cycle of deployment and integration of these tools. And in this specific use case, right, the LLM generated responses to patients' medical advice questions will leverage the round of red teaming to kind of get a better understanding of this map of the legal risk surface They help clinicians and healthcare administration meaningfully account for the limitations and failure modes of the AI system, which helps them put in place this specific mitigations, which can look like content filters, for example, for what is the model allowed to say or not, and how do we flag those kind of high risk scenarios for human review. And ultimately, how can that build more trust and help practitioners scale?
I want to piggyback on that for just a second, that this iterative part of it, and we always use this phrase, rounds of red teaming. It's so important because these are really unpredictable tools. The more you play with them, the more you see that, no one really knows, not just how they work, but what they're going to do when you make a change. And so, you know, we can give plenty of anonymous but very real examples where we'll do a round, there will be a mitigation, we'll come back and try it again, and it's like maybe it solved one problem, but it's opened up a whole new set of problems. And then sometimes we had this experience recently in clamping down on some very unwanted outputs. It essentially almost lobotomized the LLM to the point where it wasn't even worth using an LLM anymore. You could do better with just a set of scripted FAQs. So it's not a one and done, and we really do. I mean, I really do think there will need to be some combination in the future of built-in automated tooling for some sort of continuous or semi-continuous monitoring, but then periodic deeper dives, because these things are wily.
Yeah, definitely. And just to close out, red teaming again is just one piece, but it's a really critical piece of evaluating LLM systems, and specifically in healthcare applications due to the high sensitivity and impact of some of these tools. And it's the legal red teaming framework really encapsulates both legal and reputational risks to using LLMs in healthcare. And again, as Danny and Bobby have said, this is an interdisciplinary process. It's a multi-stage process. It's a continuous process, right? We have to go round and round with all of these different parties, practitioners, attorneys, data scientists, administrators. All of these people have to be continually involved in the process in order to get the maximum benefit out of the LLM evaluation. And here's some sources we've used throughout the talk, and then just wanted to thank you very much, and I think we can open it up for a discussion.
And there are great questions in the chat, but leave it to our hosts if you want to just read some of those out, or have people ask questions live.
Yeah, folks can either kind of raise their hand like Mark is doing and introduce yourself and ask your question, or drop it in the chat and I'll read them out. I'll let Mark go.
Mark needs no introduction, but Mark, do you want to kick off?
So first off, Danny, Bogdana, and Sam, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're very deep into an area that a lot of people are curious about. So I have a weird question. Okay, you showed the example of the New York Times piece about MyChart responses. And I think that piece was just amazing for highlighting, I think, some of the confusion amongst a lot of healthcare leaders about what constitutes a high risk versus low risk use case.
Yeah.
So, and I would say that there is kind of a widespread challenge right now over even defining kind of how to categorize risk. A lot of organizations want to do risk-based triaging and risk-based governance of AI. So I'm curious if you have a set of kind of baseline interrogations or deposition questions to figure out how likely is it that an LLM for a specific use case can result in harm. Is there a way to use a set of tools to even categorize risk for different use cases to help people like do that mapping?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question, Mark. And there's even a nuance I think that I hadn't thought about before, that is implicit in your question, and so I'll hit that as well, because it's a neat point. I mean, the first answer, and it's not going to be very satisfying to people, is most laws that are coming out talking about AI and risk stratification, and they all say, and this includes also like, NIST and ISO and things that are more standards. They all say the right thing, which is all AI is not the same, and there's different risks based on use cases or by AI system. So you have to have a risk-based approach. The unfortunate corollary to that for everyone on this call, though, is healthcare is almost always given as the example of a high-risk use case. And so that sort of leaves us a lot of times saying, well, what do we do with that, right? Now, there are, I think, degrees of risk within healthcare, we can all agree. And not every, a general wellness app type thing is, how's your sleep? Is a little different than a sepsis predictor, to use a familiar example. So I think reasonable people can do gradations of risk, even though for a lot of these things you're still going to be legally within a higher risk bucket, which will set a certain set of conditions regardless. The good news is all these rules are pretty vague and flexible at this point. So even if you're stuck in a higher risk bucket, I think you still have a lot of flexibility to say, in this particular use case, here are the risks and here's how we're going to mitigate them. So there's a bit of a spectrum even to have within that. And then the point that you made, Mark, that I hadn't really thought of before is people usually do think of risk stratification by use case, but you make a really good point, which is even a benign tool in a non-risky deployment could create risk if someone misuses it. This tracks a question in the comments about what about people using these off indications, so to speak. So we do see that. Like, we red teamed a retail chatbot, LLM based chatbot for a big box retailer. And you could say in a lot of ways that's a low risk use case, right? It's tell me how much this, bow and arrow costs, and it, hopefully gets it right. And you could mitigate that risk with a little disclaimer that says, the AI makes mistakes, check this link. And it's low risk, so people will live with that disclaimer. But if it also tells you how to do, a poison cocktail, if you ask it, so I think that's a very interesting point, which is that risk is both use case, but also capability.
Thank you.
I'll make one other point, sorry, just because I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of frustration too out there that we hear because it's so cheap to adopt these tools. Like, foundation models are incredibly powerful. They're available open source. It really doesn't take that much at this point to ground it with a RAG database or something else. And I think then people think like, well, but it's so expensive to test it, but they're indexing against how cheap it is to roll these things out. So I think it's really important when you think about risk stratification, something can be very expensive to get right, even though it's very cheap to deploy. And that's just a cognitive dissonance that I think we're all wrestling with. But if you're using these tools in a way that affects health and safety, you're sort of on the hook.
One of the questions I'm seeing in the chat from Richard Purcell is, how are you selecting the data for your LLMs? How do you get healthcare systems to integrate data sets from a variety of EHRs to build and test the LLM?
Oh, that's a great question. So Sam, do you want to talk about kind of the red teaming approach and how we don't need to source data typically for that?
Yeah, so for red teaming specifically, right, we're not building the LLM. We're coming in sort of after the initial building process, after, if they're doing a RAG database that's including, databases that they need to, feed into the LLM, right? So we're coming in sort of after the fact and, trying to probe it and making sure that it's working as intended. So we are not, we are developing our own LLMs separately, but those are more like legal risk tools or legal practice tools for our own attorneys. But we're not actively developing anything in the healthcare space right now.
But you're right for sure in the question that for sort of the more traditional bias testing and other types of testing that Sam has done for years, like that old, like, is it benign or malignant? There we oftentimes, or even in the insurance industry, there we often do have to source data because you're really testing against a validation data set. And there the issue of data quality comes in. Less so with the LLMs. Although sometimes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good point, Danny, because like the benchmarking that we talked about at the beginning, right? That requires some level of ground truth. Like if you have maybe there's a healthcare data set that has a set of questions and desired answers out of an LLM, and then you could do some benchmarking there. So, but that's a more, I think the interesting thing about benchmarking is you can kind of create a custom benchmark for just about anything. And so making sure that the benchmark aligns with your intended use cases and sort of what you want to get out of the model. And then you can do some automation that way. And that's another way to get data. But again, that also is going to require a lot of internal stakeholder feedback from, practitioners, administrators, patients, and so forth.
Yeah. And then there's just the bigger question of getting good, high quality healthcare data in general for medical AI or other AI. And, people are probably pretty familiar with all those examples, but like using health claims, data that can have economic, socioeconomic biases sort of implicitly encoded into them can lead to some pretty famous examples of biased outputs. So, and we do see that we're just often testing it in a more open-ended way than just having a comparator data set. I will say it's an open problem. Like we have talked about when you're testing a generative AI system for bias, can you get it down to discrete enough outputs where like you would feed in a set of resumes and then be able to test against that data set and do perturbations, those sort of counterfactuals that we talked about. So I do think that's going to have a role to play. Yeah, I see a hand up. Mirage, did I say that right?
That is right. Mirage, Director of Responsible AI at Chai. Thank you so much for a great talk. I have a couple questions. One about sort of the risk of content filters as well, sort of on the back end. You mentioned like sometimes the usefulness of the tool will completely go away if you just have so much content filters put in place. But what if content filters reduce the sort of nuance or information like retrieval necessary for the question to be accurately answered? Which I suppose is that kind of thing, but could also produce harm. Like it may produce answers that are useful, but not, but could still be harmful. Is there a way to sort of account for that piece? It's my first question. The second is related to the actual automatic generation of the sort of red teaming prompts. I'm assuming that, let's say you had two different sepsis models, you're not using the same auto-generated prompts for each of those models, or is that true that you would? Because I'm assuming there's like a variability in what is generated every single time. So there's like some noise component.
Yeah. Yeah, Bobby, do you want to take the first one about the guardrails?
Yeah,
and into the
consequences.
consequences?
So content filters, these are great questions. Yeah, thank you very much. Really top of mind for this entire field. And yes, content filters are a specific example of a guardrail. And we've seen a lot of development in that, in just the more broadly, just the LLM space, right? And you're right about this sort of concern that they're making the outputs of the LLM less useful. And I think what's fascinating there is that when we add more complexity to the content filters themselves, then we can have a more granular level of understanding of kind of what is the potential risk or why certain content needs to be sort of filtered out or not, right? So it's not like a very binary sort of yes, no approach, right? So the more we have a more granular level of understanding of what exactly is the potential risk, the more we can give more nuance and explainability to the decision making in the interaction layer, right? As they're interacting with the tool about kind of what is happening, right? And we can have the decision maker kind of be the human in the loop, right? So this whole field is very much related to the explainability space, right? So it is about adding more granularity and more complexity to what is really a content filter.
Yeah, and if I could add to that too, Bobby, just having that cycle that we were talking about, and this goes to your second question too about, you know, are you asking the same questions? Are you asking different questions? When you have sort of we generate, you know, 100, 1,000, 10,000 questions to pose to the LLM. You know, we're doing that iteratively. So we have this set of questions, and then we get the responses, and then we maybe make some suggestions for mitigation, and then those mitigations are implemented, and then we come back with the same questions and sort of see what's changed. And so by asking those same questions in the same application, in the same context, we're sort of able to better answer that, like, okay, what has, you know, changing this guardrail or this, you know, content filter, how has it affected the whole breadth of responses that the model gives?
Yeah, and I do think we're starting to see and experience efficiencies. You know, the first few times we did this, you know, it was very artisanal, very, you know, we're building the plane as we fly it kind of thing. But now we're starting to see enough recurrence that while you always have to be adaptive because these tools are variable by nature, we can reuse taxonomies, and, you know, with just a little modification. So it's starting to feel like something that we can scale as these things proliferate. Probably have time for one more question.
I see one from Heather Bassett. How do you see this panning out when dealing with vendors, particularly those that fine-tune LLMs with augmented data sets?
Yeah. Well, I'll share a quick thought, and the group probably has lots of thoughts on this. You know, there's a wide variety of vendors out there. And it's not necessarily a big versus small. Like, you know, there's some startups that, you know, we even work with in building some of our own models, and they're wonderful. You know, and they so it's not just a size thing, but there's just a lot of people out there, and there's a lot of variation in quality. You know, some people are just putting a wrapper on, you know, the same old generic naive models, and then some people really are, you know, helping fine tune and RAG and all that. But there's a ton of variation in the quality of that as well. You know, the way you set up your RAG database, and even things like, you know, we saw one really interesting case where the data that was in the RAG, the model was not realizing that newer data might have more value than older data in the scientific literature. It just didn't have that sense of time for whatever reason. And so it was, you know, coming up with, you know, sort of giving preferential weight to some things that were a bit outdated. So little things like that and just how it's set up. So, I mean, a couple quick observations. One is, you know, the guardrails of the underlying foundation model, when someone comes in and does orchestration on top of it, that can change the reliability of those guardrails. And we've seen that over and over. So a lot of times people will say, like, well, we don't have to worry about toxicity because we're using XYZ model and those are the world's best engineers, guarding against toxicity. But the AI system as a whole, as modified, even though they didn't touch the underlying base model, we still see weird behaviors that were unexpected. So I do think you test at the level of deployment when you're coming with vendors that are building on that sort of larger AI supply chain. But Sam or Bobby?
Yeah, and I was just say, just to add on to that, the traditional AI vendor too. I think we can learn a lot from that, like vendor acquisition and vetting process, because again, you have to make sure that the tool that you're purchasing is relevant for your context, for your use case, for your populations, right? And all of these things you would do in a typical, traditional AI vendor context as well. So I think we can learn a lot from both that previous experience, and also, as Danny said, I have loads of experience with testing more traditional AI systems as well, and so I think we can take some of that knowledge as well. Again, because it's, as Danny said, it's the point of deployment that is most important.
Yeah, and just a very quick final thought. The law is a mess on this issue about who bears responsibility. This is something Mark knows we've been talking and writing about for years, how this kind of scrambles the traditional accountabilities between healthcare providers and device makers and software vendors, so much so that in Europe we're even seeing like presumptions of you could just sue everybody and unscramble it, leave it to the defendants to unscramble the egg. So I think TBD on who has to do the red teaming, but I think someone has to. And that's the key. Make sure that someone is doing, all the relevant testing needed for that use case.
Well, Danny, I'll just say, I think that health systems have a lot to learn about how to take this on. So Sierra, I'll give it to you for closing comments, but thank you for joining today.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Sam, Bobby, and Danny, for joining today and for your presentation. I know people were really excited about this, and we really appreciated the talk and all the questions. So thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.